We are moving towards the next session, which is a panel discussion on the topic India's defense strategy in forging strategic partnership in the post-COVID era. In this regard, I would like to invite the panel chair, Commodore Uday Rao sir, former Principal Director of Naval Intelligence and former Director, Cabinet Secretariat, to take over. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bala. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know, all good things in life have to come to an end. So we are coming to the last session of this two-day seminar. I know, at least my stomach is indicating it is lunchtime. Okay, so this session may be good food for thought. We have an impressive lineup of panelists, starting with General Murali Krishnan, whom I have never had the good fortune to meet. Maybe some other time. We've got Group Captain Chandrasekharan. Again, I haven't met him. And of course, Commodore Vasan, who's a senior and is a colleague. Now, in the last couple of months, we've been in for surprise and shock with COVID-19 and with Galwan. I don't know why we were surprised about the Wuhan virus or about the Galwan. As far as COVID is concerned, all three services have been affected, but within controls. And actually, we were first off the ground, the three services. So that's a good thing. But the important thing is, while we were showering flowers on our Wuhan warriors, China seems to have come into Galwan. We were so obsessed with showering flower petals that it didn't notice China coming in. You know, today we are all experts. Some are satellite imagery experts, some are defense experts. Everybody has an opinion. The army, I have done the Army Higher Command course several years back, and the army has a difficult task in the north. Whether it is the climate, the weather, whether it is China, whether it is intelligence, the ITBP, are they a part of the army? I don't know. Navy, of course, has its own clips. I spoke to a serving admiral yesterday, and he says, look, they have taken away our P-81, it is going north. We don't have seeking helicopters. So how the hell are we going to detect a submarine? And to add to insult to injury, they have taken MiG-29s north. And I don't know if it's true or false. The IAF, of course, is quite happy with the 5 Rafale. This story has been repeated so many times that I don't know whether China is confused as to how many Rafales we have got, or we have confused ourselves. In any case, MEA is also a great actor in the strategic partnerships. Actually, MEA is the king of the jungle, and we have to work with MEA. So talking of strategic partnership in this times, of course, we have the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, Israel. The Navy has done some bit of diplomacy in terms of Operation Samudra Setu and Sagar, which I mentioned yesterday. Now, coming to the speakers, I am not going to introduce them because I'm sure that these speakers know their bio profile better than me. So what I will do is I will request each one of them in turn, starting with the Army General Murali Krishnan, Gopala Krishnan, to first talk about himself briefly, and then deliver a talk all within 10 minutes. Thereafter, of course, Navy and Commodore Vasan, and finally the Air Force, in that order, Army, Navy, Air Force. And thereafter, we will take on some questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was told that I am the moderator, not speaker. So, therefore, I will end here and let the General take over, please.
With your permission, just a small intervention. You were not able to see the message that I had sent. We just needed 5 minutes out of this session for Rishi to talk about a book where all the three panelists who are here today have contributed. So, with your permission, we'll request Rishi to come and talk to us for just 3-5 minutes.
Please, sir, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Commodore. Commodore Rao and Commodore Vasan, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Am I audible? Fine. I'll start by thank you very much for the opportunity again to talk about the book. And here I'll start and I'll share this with you. I hope you're able to see it on your screen. This is the book. I hope you're able to see it on your screen.
Not yet. It's coming up.
Coming up, sir.
Yeah, seen.
You've seen it. Very good, sir. Well, this book comes out of a conference that was held at INS Adyar on the 28th of March 2019. It is a conference that was jointly organized by the Chennai Center for China Studies, the National Maritime Foundation, with the able support of the Indian Coast Guard and the Indian Navy. And as you all know, Track 2 events are extremely important. And this book talks about India's maritime neighborhood. And India's maritime neighborhood pretty much is about the Indo-Pacific. And when they talk about challenges and opportunities, so this covers a number of important topics. And it talks about the challenges India faces, especially China. And a number of topics have been discussed. For example, General Murli has a chapter on Kautilya's Arthashastra and how that applies, sort of an Indo-realism, if you'd like. Or Group Captain Chandrasekhar has a chapter about coastal security, which is very important since he brings a perspective both from the Air Force and having served in the Andaman and Nicobar Joint Command. And of course, Commodore Vasan is one of the editors of the book. So he too has a contribution to it, and he was mainly the person behind organizing the conference. And what I would request all of you to see is there is a chapter on maritime diplomacy, which also talks about the role of, since you talked about Samudra Setu and the like. Diplomacy is very important, and the Indian Navy has a major role. And one of the other people to have a chapter in this is Ambassador C.V. Ranganathan, who's one of the vice presidents of C3S. So what I'd request all of you to do is to please, the book is now available on Kindle. And of course, we have distinguished contributors here. So talking about biographical notes, their biographies are there in the book. So I'd request all of you to please have a look at the link, and have a look at the cover. The book is available on Kindle. Please see the link. And if you think it will fit into any library or even into any of your personal collection, please do avail yourself the opportunity to buy the book. Thank you very much for your time. I commend this book to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, Chair, for allowing this to happen. I just saw that there was a coincidence in all the three panelists, who had contributed to this book. And Rishi floated this idea of saying that, maybe we can acknowledge their contribution. And he himself has also been an editor. So I'd also like to thank Rishi for, bringing about, the complete editorial effort, which was phenomenal. And thanks for this opportunity. Over to you, Chair.
I request the Lieutenant General Gopal Krishnan to please start.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Major Murli here, and I must confess that it's been a great learning experience yesterday and today. Listening to people dealing with this subject actually reinforces your own beliefs and also gives a differing approach to an issue. I'm not wanting to take time in introducing myself, except saying that I continued the lineage of my father, who served in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. And that was my motivation to join the Air Force first, which I could not because of my eyesight, and then later on the Indian Army. And I joined the National Defence Academy in 1974. Retired from OTA Chennai in 2015, pursuing my PhD in Arthashastra in the Madras University, the subject being formulating the national security strategy through the tenets of Arthashastra. It's got a lot of scope, and it's up to me to how much I can constrict or expand the scope of it. So I thank the Institute of Contemporary Studies, Chennai Center for China Studies, Press Institute of India, for giving me this platform to speak on a very topical issue. I shall speak for 10 minutes, taking the cue from Commodore Uday, with a simple narrative on the imbroglio and explain on a new normal in international relations created by the ground actions of the armed forces. Well, there have been a barrage of analysis from experts in deciphering the reasons behind the recent Chinese assertions against India. All the analyses are individual and experiential interpolations because it is very difficult to ferret the Chinese rationale behind their actions. But what stands out is the relative degree of assertiveness, confidence, and a bit of arrogance, if you may say, on the part of India, which was absent in the earlier times. Now, the conciliatory mood has given way to aggressive replies and countermoves. Is it related to COVID-19? Yes or no, we could debate on it. But I would say that India's coalition diplomacy at the start of the COVID crisis, coupled with its display of leadership in marshalling global response and providing medicines, is a new normal and a threat to China. China prefers India to be a subordinate partner in Asia and world affairs. A resurgent India is a threat to its ambitions and spoke on its concept of subjugation of peripheral nations. We are additionally burdened by expenditures of maintaining additional force, hasty procurements, and tackling economic and security fronts simultaneously. Well, it may not be a retaliation, so to say, in COVID times, because there was no direct actions taken by India on the COVID issue in comparison to the rest of the world. When I say rest of the world, I would say UK, USA, Australia, and Japan. And maybe to an extent, the EU now. Of course, we have been provoking an anti-China agenda among the populace, using the legal handle to restrict trade and commerce, and continuing with military-level disengagement talks as scalable features of the response. Now, the present crisis could be related to China's baser instinct: large territory, absolute power, and obeisance from all. China longs to be number one. Now, I would like to believe this narrative, a simple narrative, and go on to talk about the other aspect which I have just mentioned. Now, the recent incidents of military nudging by China, covering an arc of approximately 1,000 kilometers from Daulat Beg Oldi in Ladakh to Nakula in Sikkim, are timed during a pandemic crisis and severe economic downturn. It's an opportune moment to test, assess, and exert influence. Now, the conditions prevailing in India during the 62 war was of unpreparedness physically and political apathy to matters defense. Both conditions are absent now, which leads us to ponder whether China made a strategic blunder. Now, Arthashastra considers an enemy in trouble with the subjects oppressed, ill-treated, and victim to pestilence. Epidemics as opportune moment to be offensive. China has all these symptoms. Perhaps India's strong stance may be a strain of the Kautilian thought. Now, talking of the military perspective, after listening to the experts in the last 2 days, and of course the tsunami of opinions and views in the past 3 months, leave little scope for something out of the box. So therefore, I will restrict my perception to a few informative points concerning the demonstrated capabilities and capacities of the Indian Armed Forces. The Army would be doing, assuming the permanency of the tactical situation in Ladakh and building it up to the international relations level. Now, first, from Uri to Balakot to Ladakh to the high seas, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force have demonstrated their capabilities of deliverance when called upon to do so. Freedom from political interference to plan and execute operations is the singular reason for the demonstrated success in all three actions. It's a direct reflection on the capacity and capability of our commanders in planning and executing operations, tactical level leadership of officers, and the fighting ability of our men. It also demonstrates the adaptability of our troops in difficult situations and in handling modern weapons and equipment in combat. The political hierarchy hereafter cannot have any doubts on the might of the armed forces. I am to believe that there were a lot of doubts in the earlier regime, or which the reason for all the inactions. Now, in the world of national interests, the chief methods of international conflict management were traditional diplomatic, military, and economic means of influence, up to and including the threat or use of force. Now, it is usual to say that diplomacy precedes an armed conflict. Use of the armed forces has been the last resort in conflict resolution. Now, India has shown a new normal in international relations. Now, let me use the analogy of a simple tactical term called firm base, used by the army in tactical battles. Now, it is nothing but an area of tactical importance for launching an offensive operations. We elevate the concept to the national level. The armed forces have provided a firm base for the nation to carry out its diplomatic war. The actions by India against China or even Pakistan seems to have reversed the concept and doctrine of war and peace. The new normal has been to gain spatial advantage by offensive actions followed by negotiations. Now, perhaps I also admit it's an abstraction, but today we have established tactical advantage prior to negotiating for peace. Is it a new thought? It's a point to ponder and leave that with you. Now, what's happening in the ground? Now, the ground situation of preemptive deployments in Ladakh, enhanced logistics, forward deployments of the Air Force and the Indian Navy assumes a permanency. Trust deficit, of course, is the biggest impediment in normalized relations between countries. China has historically and even now given enough evidence of their untrustworthiness. Secondly, the present political dispensation is not naive, nor are they lotus eaters as in the past. Therefore, the army has to endure a situation of permanency in Eastern Ladakh. The army's focus will be on force management, logistic sustenance, communications, among other issues. Now, I'm sure the Indian Army would have redeployed its troops on the unoccupied sectors of the Indo-China border in its entirety. It will have to redesignate reserve forces. Now, troops deployed at high altitude will have to be relieved in a time-bound manner, and relief of troops is therefore an important planning consideration. The army was maintaining 2 divisions and winter stocking was a routine and streamlined operation. Now, it's well over 3 divisions along with mechanized elements. Time is limited before winter sets. However, the Rohtang Tunnel and engineering marvel is just in time for continued logistic build-up even in winters. Now, what has this created a situation is fast-track procurements of essential armaments, weapons, high-altitude clothing, and coordination of command and control as high-priority parameters for immediate action and execution. As we debate these issues, I'm sure most of the actions would have been well underway at the respective headquarters of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and also the CDS. Now, coming to the subject of international security and sustainable development, it is extraordinarily wide-ranging and involves 3 crucial issues to be addressed, as I feel it. How to live, which is development, how to live with each other, which is security, and how to live with nature, which is sustainability. Now, going back to Kautilya's philosophy, which is based on the concept of Trivarga, which is Artha, which is material well-being, and Vriddhi, which is sustenance or livelihood, and Dharma, which is righteousness in all actions, to fulfill our desires. He does not say do not fulfill desires. So I would leave this august audience with a pragmatic saying that the pragmatic application of a Kautilyan philosophy is a likely solution in any crisis. I'm in no way trying to propagate the aspect just because I'm doing the thesis. So the narrative now, of course, shifts from, I take the analogy from the bridge game, from preemptive bids to forcing contracts by India. Because we have secured positional and diplomatic advantage. Now, is it a Kautilyan realism? So I leave this thought with you and end my 2 penny words. Thank you and Jai Hind.
Thank you, General Sir. That was crisp and short. Thank you so much. I now call upon Commodore Vasan to deliver his talk.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also for the presentation that preceded mine, and which talks about Kautilya and Arthashastra. I'm not going to introduce myself. 34 years in the Navy, half of that in think tanks. So I'm half of a scholar and not even a full soldier. So come on, Bala, please start sharing my screen. I have just 5 slides. I thought it will be crisper and ensure that I do not overshoot the time. I would like to keep the relevance to what has been the title of this panel, which is about India's defense strategy in forging strategic partnership in the post-COVID era. So it's a vast subject. So I'm not going to go through the entire gamut of my presentation. I've condensed this to just 5 slides. And it's very obvious why India is oriented this way. This is an old trick that was used way back by Admiral Mihir Roy when he was commanding Vikrant, 1974, when I was on board. And this will give you the correct perspective of how India should be seen, and not through a land orientation. Next, please. Next. So this will be more a staccato presentation, so bear with me because of the time, but we can come back to the discussions. So these are some of the contours that define the power play, and mostly dictated by China. Next, I'll go ahead and show all of them. Otherwise I'll lose time. We can show all of them. Essentially, this is the triangle that I'm looking at, which has the base, which defines how China wants to grow and how it wants to project its power to the rest of the world. And it also would like to propagate China with Chinese characteristics, whether it's democracy, whether it's economic system, political system, or whatever. And the 3 things that you see on top in this is related to the economic power potential, then the strategic military clout to protect its interests, both in the near neighborhood and in the far seas, and battle space domination through technology, through reorientation of the theaters, through negotiations, through application of coercion and pressure, through many means, including diplomatic means, economic means, strategic means, etc. So this is what defines the contours of power play as far as China is concerned. And therefore, we need to look at how we can counter it. Next, please. So this, of course, is clear that I'm not going at the milestones again. Continue with this. So this is the clash that has emerged. So I showed this slide at another conference in Pondicherry. So I modified it to just tell you that these are the important factors that will continue to drive the kind of power play that has emerged both in the Indo-Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean region. We saw this also in Day 1 conference, where Commodore Udara looked at Chinese ambitions and aspirations in IOR, and Bala looked at what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a summary of how this power play is going to emerge. What we need to acknowledge is there is an ASEAN centrality to the Indo-Pacific. How you define, I'm not going to it. I did that on day 1. Then there is now developments which are looking at the strategic partnerships. To me, the topmost out of this is the Indo-Pacific Command, the Quad++, which I'll discuss a little more during the QA. Then the Chinese initiatives such as the BRI, we can call it OBOR, and of course, its demonstrated potential to ignore international statutes, whether it is UNCLOS or even the Code of Conduct closer home in the South China Sea disputes, or even across the Taiwan Straits. What it is driven by is this desire, where it has demonstrated its capability and capacity for total battle space domination, and it is also bringing out its carrier battle group, which has not come out of Malacca Straits yet, but a day is not too distant when you'll see the CBG, because you saw in the presentation earlier that building a berth for the carrier in Djibouti. And it will also be coming up in Gwadar and Hambantota in the near future. It's also got the largest navy with 350 plus ships, and obviously it's catering for a situation which it has to defend its closer seas and then also move into the far seas to protect its commercial and strategic interests. The pivot to Asia now is a reality. What it started off as pivot to Asia is now brought back USA in a big way post-COVID, and this is where there will be new strategic alliances which will not be something that China would be happy about. Next. And within the Indian Ocean, without wasting too much of time, what you need to do is how the present strategy of India will complement our efforts to take on China. So the Maritime Neighborhood first, the Sagar Initiative, which is the security and growth for all in the region. And also there is a word which was used earlier, which is to say that India can be the net security provider. I've always used a different term, which is net security facilitator, because we do not have the capacity and capability to be a net security provider. That assumes a lot in terms of being able to protect 4 million square kilometers of search and rescue region and 2 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone. So the Chinese forays in IOR have allowed us a certain amount of options to be exercised, provided there is political will. This is in terms of engaging the profile of IORA, elevating it to higher levels, Milan, BIMSTEC, TOSTI, which lay dormant when Maldives was under a power which was inimical to India's interests, South Asia analysis, SAARC grouping, which is always held hostage to Pakistan. But there are opportunities here because India threw open its space and nuclear helping hand to our neighbors. And these are things that will allow our strategic alliances to move forward and have certain amount of options to take on China. Next one. The one point I missed out there was about the geographical advantage that we have. We need to be conscious of this, but not take it for granted. China is overcoming its geographical imbalance by having bases, having the string of pearls, engaging with economic routes through African and Asian countries, engaging in Iran. So all these are factors that are going to come in the way. Bala, the previous one. Yeah, go ahead with this. Go ahead with it. It doesn't matter. No, come forward. Yeah, show all the points. So what does it tell us as far as possibilities for strategic alliances are concerned? The inevitability of Cold War, we are part of it. The trade warfare and technology denial, you saw it in 5G, you saw it in SCT and other areas, that is inevitable. Hold on. New alignments will be forced. There will be a setback to China's ambitions and Xi's dream. And we need to ensure that the new alliances will definitely have a new global order that would emerge, that would assist and favor India's new trajectory. Hardening of positions of undecided players like India. I think China has actually favored us by pushing us positively into a new alliance, whether it's Quad++ or whether it is our initiative to move away from RCEP, etc. There's a new trajectory that's enabled more by China and not because India wanted to take that path. Impact on global institutions, WHO, IMF, etc., where India has to play an increasing role because we have, after all, now been supported by 182 nations in getting a seat in the UNGA. Creation of alternate pools for countering BRI. I'm talking about the AAGC. I'm talking about getting European Union on board. I'm talking about other countries who can come together, create alternate pools which will counter the Chinese economic, ingress into our neighborhood. Increased military posturing and increasing defense spending is inevitable. So we need to see how, with an economy that is badly hit, how will we sustain our defense aspirations? So which is where Quad holds an answer, because you can't do it alone, so join hands with others. Next. So this is the future of strategic partnership that would come up. It is predicated on the cases of ambitious Atmanirbharata. How will it succeed? We need to make it succeed. And economic revival. This is a huge challenge for any government, not just Indian government. So these are some of these which are definitely dependent on how we succeed in Atmanirbharata and how an economic revival is something that is inescapable and which will require path-breaking changes in our decision-making process. So all these which are listed here can be taken up in the question and answer session. Next. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasan sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, you had two insightful presentations, first by the General and then by Commodore Vasan. And now I'll request Group Captain Chandrasekhar to kindly take off and enlighten us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Special thanks to Commodore Vasan for having given me the opportunity to speak in this particular forum. I'm Group Captain Chandrasekharan, served in the Indian Air Force for about 34.5 years and left in July 2018 and settled down in Chennai. I've just completed my PhD and yet to submit the dissertation. It was basically an Indo-China rivalry, Asia's emerging Cold War. The hypothesis was, in case of a showdown, will it lead to a nuclear exchange or will it remain conventional? That was the theme of the dissertation. Now, coming to the talk today, for the last 3 presentations I made, I happen to be the graveyard speaker. I don't know whether it's by design or by default. I'm standing between you and all of the lunch. I'll just try to ensure that I do not take more than 10 or 12 minutes to finish this presentation. With absolutely no end in sight and the army getting ready for a long haul, the Air Force has got a role pitched in because it has to look after the logistical requirements of the army. So accordingly, the Indian Air Force is geared up in all the sectors, because as far as China is concerned, currently the imbroglio is only in the Ladakh sector. But we cannot afford to neglect the central, the Sikkim and the Arunachal sector. And accordingly, all the bases in these sectors have also been activated. And we also have a very hostile friend like Pakistan, who may try to take and avail the opportunity to create mischief. And hence, LOC also could not be neglected. And currently in the Ladakh, we have adopted both offensive and a defensive posture, and our assets, both offensive and defense assets, have already been positioned. And we all have the facility of our own aircraft operating from close ranges. When I say close ranges, it's not only Toys and Leh, it's also Avantipur, Srinagar and other places, because it gives us very short reaction times. As you know, the various ALGs at DBO, Fukche, Neoma and all have been fully activated. And Toys and Leh, of course, are capable of handling fighter operations. The other ALGs are capable of handling transport and helicopter operations. And in addition, Neoma has already been strengthened with bitumen, and it will be able to take a heavier payload. And we have also recently activated Vijay Behara, it's a highway by the side of Anantnag for an emergency landing facility. And you see a Charlie 130 Hercules, which landed in DBO recently. We have deployed all our offensive assets there, starting off from the Su-30, which you see on the top, with an Apache in the center, and the Chinook heavy lift helicopters have also been inducted into the theater. Apaches, basically, it's a replacement for the Mi-25-35s, which were in the service for the last 30 years with the Indian Air Force. But unfortunately, it had to sit down during the Kargil war because of the high parameters. Those have been addressed, and Apaches are fully capable of operating in very high altitudes to the maximum efficiency with a maximum payload. And Apaches basically will be used for CSO-4 operations, what we call counter surface 4 operations, where we normally tend to target the fuel dumps, their observations, and also anti-armor operations. The Chinook, after the Mi-26, which was the only heavy lift helicopter which we had, the Chinooks have been inducted into Chandigarh, and they basically facilitate transporting of troops to various forward locations in eastern Ladakh. It's got tremendous capabilities, including high maneuverability. It has got all-weather day and night capability, and it has got the ability to operate in the mountain, and hence it's a huge force multiplier and also a critical strategic asset. And the Chinooks are ably assisted by Mi-17 V5s, which are based in almost all the bases in J&K, and they also continue carrying out the air maintenance sorties. And this ensures that the Indian Army is capable of rapid troops transformation and also inter-valley troop transfers. The Chinook's height parameter, you can see, it has got a maximum height ceiling of 20,000 feet at a cruising speed of about 291 kilometers, and it can cover a span of almost 420 kilometers. In addition, the Indian Navy, as a classic case of interoperability, has also pitched in, and the P-8-1, the Poseidon, the Boeing Poseidon, is also pressed. It's a strategic surveillance aircraft. It is carrying out various strategic missions in eastern Ladakh, and it is giving a lot of very, very critical and highly valuable information to the Indian Army about the troop movements of the Chinese. It is very pertinent to mention this was used extensively in Doklam also. And the shore-based MiG-29s, we have about 40 MiG-29s of the Indian Navy, out of which 18 are based on the aircraft carrier Vikramaditya. The shore-based MiG-29s of the Indian Navy from Goa has also been moved to air defense operations to the forward base. The operational capability of the P-81 is already available there. It's got a huge array of sensors and other equipments on board, which it's a huge game changer as far as the troop movement detection is concerned. In addition, also, we have the facilities of aircrafts which can take off from Rajasthan. We can take off from Suratgarh, Nal and other places, and Punjab. They can refuel aerially and carry out offensive operations. Now, what I'm saying in the photograph, you'll see a buddy refueling. See, refuelers happen to be a high-value aerial assets and hence become vulnerable to enemy aerial attacks. I'm extremely sorry. In order to ensure that your high-value aerial assets are kept inside, we use a buddy refueling. Here you see a Su-30 refueling a Mirage 2000. We can use this particular thing and we'll be able to effectively carry out long-range operations. It is very, very pertinent to mention that the Indian Air Force has got an edge over the Chinese in the Ladakh region because their fighters will have to fly and take off from a high altitude basis, where what happens is they carry with maximum weapon payload, get airborne with minimum fuel. They'll have to get aerially refueled before coming in from the plains and reach the mountainous regions. Now, they do not have much of experience as far as valley flying is concerned, despite exercises they carried out with the Pakistani Air Force. On the contrary, we take off from the plains, reach the mountains, and in case we have to carry offensive operations across the border, it is basically plains there. So the IAF currently holds an absolute edge over the PLAF. Now, what happens? There are two impediments. Now, when we talk about the role of the Air Force here, we have two impediments. One is basically in case your runways and your aircrafts get targeted, then what happens? Second thing is what happens now we are in September end, what happens when winter sets in? So when we talk about the first thing, in case you're going to see, if you see the runway on the top, it's a layer runway which is there on the top. Now what happens in case they decide to target your runways and your aircraft which are parked in blast pins or hardened shelters? Now the length of a normal runway is about 9,000 feet. It will not be possible for a missile strike to take the entire runway. They can probably, when they do a precision standoff attack and all, they can probably make a few, craters in the runway. You don't put the whole runway out of action. And the Indian Air Force works on the strategic principle of surviving to operate. Okay. Now, what happens is the IAF, in case the runway is there, in case there is an emergency, we always have a parallel taxi track. The IAF is fully trained on carrying out parallel taxi track operations without compromising on the operational efficiency. Now, the hardened shelters, the photograph in the down you see is a hardened shelter which basically protects almost all the frontline fighter bases are brought with blast pens and hardened shelters which can protect against missile and special forces attacks. And in case Chinese will have to use a heavy cruise missile to take one particular aircraft or two aircrafts parked, it becomes a very costly affair. Now I told you about the craters. If you actually looked the runway, you can see two craters which has happened because of a bombing attack which took place. Now, basically to ensure that these runways are repaired, the MES and the Indian Air Force have got something called a runway rehabilitation scheme where they immediately press into action and they get this runways repaired. One is basically you use a rapid hardening cement concrete, which immediately the moment it is set, within about 45 minutes to 1 hour, it dries up and the runway is ready for operation. We also use indigenously developed fiberglass mats, which will be used to level out on top of the hole and we'll be able to cover it and immediately the runway is put into action immediately. 1 minute. Now the second impediment I said is about the bad weather conditions which can play havoc as far as we are concerned. A photograph on the top you see is taken from a helicopter where the visibility is absolutely nil. Poor visibility, snowfall and cloud base can hamper operations. And this is by and large during winters is caused during the western disturbances, which is a very common phenomenon in the Ladakh area. Now, the Ladakh area experiences about 4 to 5 western disturbances in a month, and each lasting up to 3 to 4 days. That means 15 to 20 days in a month, virtually your air operations will come to a standstill during that period. So whatever assets, aerial assets you have may not be effective during peak winters there and during snowfalls there. People may say, so what? China also will have the same problem. But we have an edge. The IAF has got an edge over the PLAF as on today, and that particular edge what we have will be blunted during the next 2 months. If you see, the people are trying to remove the snow from the Leh airfield, the photograph on the bottom. If you see the photograph on the right, after every sortie, you will find a severe in-flight icing on the rotors of the helicopters, and you see the guy on the left trying to remove the ice which has been formed there. And as a result, it is going to be an extremely arduous task to use the aerial assets during winter. And similarly, the ALGs, among the ALGs, the DBO and all will not be able to use winters because the muddy ground will ensure that the snow grounds will not be possible. So we'll be able to carry out limited operations from Neoma and Phuket, but DBO virtually will be put out of action. These are the impediments which we are likely to face during these things. I'm sure the Air Force must have taken into consideration all these things, and they must have stockpiled the logistics supply. And when push comes to shove, the Air Force is capable of doing anything. Let's hope that we do not have to be forced to use our offensive assets in winter. Thank you very much, Jai Hind.
Thank you, Group Captain Chandrasekhar. I think that was a very interesting and I think a very nice presentation. We are always fascinated by air assets, at least I am.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will not take the risk of making any summary at the end of this session, because all my fellow panelists are all senior people who probably know the whole subject better than me. So what I will do, I will ask Bala to kindly take on the questions. Thank you very much.
Sure, sir. I thank the Session Sir, Commodore Vadera, sir, and all the distinguished panelists. Moving on to questions, there's a question posed by Rishi Athreya sir, who was asked to Group Captain Chandrasekhar sir. A new post of CDS has been recently created. Has this influenced the working of Joint Command and Operations?
Very, very difficult question to answer. The CDS is only supposed to coordinate all the requirements of the 3 services between the MOD. He does not have any operational say as far as the 3 services are concerned. So he will not have any say in the operations. The operations are left to the respective chiefs of all the 3 services.
Thank you, sir. There is also a question posed to Commodore Vasan sir on the role of Russia. He has already answered in the chat box, but still, may I request if something can be value added?
No, it's very simple. I did answer it there because I knew there would be time constraints. We cannot, move away from Russia altogether. It's a major arms supplier, and plus they always stood firm with us. As I had mentioned in my response, we also now started investing in Vladivostok. It shows that you are not going to abandon Russia or vice versa. That will not happen. But in the interest of having national interests served by various actors, we have said we will adopt strategic autonomy, which only means you are aligning with interests and not necessarily with nations. So on an issue, you could be aligning with America, where it helps you, and in another, you are aligning with Russia, where it's of importance. So in the interest of time, I will not elaborate further, but it's very clear that we are not going to abandon any relation that has existed in the past.
Thank you, sir. The point made was issue-based strategic alliance to be made. Thank you, sir. The next question is by Rishi Athreya sir. He has asked, given that the 2 main adversaries are on the northern frontier, would it be strategically safer to have major air power and even army facilities located in central or peninsular India? I think this is for Group Captain Chandrasekhar sir, and since being army also, it is to Sri Murli Gopalakrishnan sir, Major General Murli sir.
Sir, Murli sir, would you like to answer first before I answer?
Sir, you're muted, sir.
these have been British cantonments when it was formed, and the strike formations were placed centrally in the central peninsular India or the central median, so that they could react to any directions. And we have created those 2 additional formations in the northeast to cater specifically for the Chinese borders. And we have now the capability to move forces, and we will not move the strike corps anywhere to the north because they are not functionally, they are not operational in those areas. So moving them forward is not giving us any benefit because they can mobilize in a matter of 7 to 8 days with those battle groups which can take immediate action on the borders. So we have a certain amount of time lag between the actual actions taking place on the ground and the decisions being taken. So air may take off first, as in a conventional manner. And similar has been the case with Air Force, which of course Chandrasekharan will clarify. The range of the aircraft will become different. You don't have to have airfields close to the borders. Yeah.
Yeah, Rishi, what you're saying is correct. We do have airfields based in Bareilly, Gwalior, Gorakhpur. Of course, I've served in Gorakhpur also, where the Jaguars there have been placed to deliver the in weapons also if need so be. So the bulk of the strategic assets are placed in central India only. And as General Murli said, I think today, in case a push comes to a shove, I think the integrated battle groups are forming, and which has got an element of the air also in this. And I think we'll be able to respond rapidly to the requirement. And yes, most of the bases which are there in the front, in the western sector, are prone to artillery attacks from the Pakistani side, and that is one of the reasons we are moving in.
Thank you, sir. There are 2 questions to Group Captain Chandrasekhar, sir. One is, Indian Air Force has embarked on network-centric warfare from early 2000 with the superior cyber warfare of PLA Air Force. Would the Indian Air Force be able to counter such an offensive in a short war?
I will not be able to elaborate too much on this particular thing, but I can only assure you that we are fully capable of taking them on. India has got its own, cyber wing also. The Indian Air Force has got its own cyber wing, and they are fully geared up for the network-centric warfare, but we will not be able to discuss operational details here.
Thank you, sir. Next question for Group Captain, sir, is that since we are setting down into winter, in case of a short war during the winter, how would the operations be affected in such a scenario?
As I rightly told you, the offensive operations are going to be greatly hampered. Even, see, the most important thing is even presuming that the aircrafts take off from Suratgarh, take off from Nal, because I'm saying that Punjab is also likely to experience bad weather. That's why I'm taking about the fair weather, airfields in Nal and Suratgarh. We get airborne. There are 2 ways to go into Ladakh. One is you have to go through the valley, or you'll have to go through Himachal. Okay, presuming that you have mid-air refueling and then you go over the targets. Now, because of the western disturbances, in case even if you fly high, if there is a cloud blanket beneath you, I think your weapon delivery and other thing may not be very effective. It is going to be extremely difficult. It is going to be extremely challenging. That's all I can say.
Thank you, sir. The last question for this session is by Mr. Rishi Atreya, sir. He has asked, if Leh is inhospitable, why not have the major airfields in Manali, Srinagar, or any other place?
Srinagar has already got a fully operational airfield. I told you we have Amantipur also, which is a satellite airfield, which is an APSU. I told you there is a parallel runway which has come next to Anantnag. And, most of the civil airfields are already converted for military operations. Like we saw Su-30 landing in Dehradun and all. And we have quite a few of them. And Manali also in winter will be experiencing snowfall, and we'll have probably the same problem, Rishi.
Thank you, sir. Commodore Udairaj, sir, we have come to the end of the question and answer session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bala. All that remains for me to say is thank you to my panelists, co-panelists, all the General, Commodore Vasan and Group Captain Chandrasekhar for giving a very interesting talk. I know you were curtailed by time, but that really has not affected the quality of your presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I thank the session chair, Commodore Uday Rao, sir. I thank the distinguished panelists, Major General Murli, sir, Commodore Vasan, sir, Group Captain Chandrasekhar, sir, for their insightful and invaluable presentation and taking the time out to be with us. Without standing in between the lunch and the distinguished guests, I would like to request Sri Pratap Heblikar, sir, Managing Trustee, Institute of Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, to sum up and present the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just take but a few minutes. Firstly, on behalf of myself and my institute, I wish to thank Commodore Vasan and Mr. Shashi Nair for having teamed up with us to make this a try think tank effort to bring to the table a subject which interests everybody. I always felt that the study and understanding of China requires greater effort. And I think in that direction, we have covered some substantial distance today. The aim of an objective of the ICSB's joint venture with PII was initially to help young journalists of 7 to 9 years of experience to understand what national security of India is. How does one understand what the army does, the navy does, what the military does, and what are the nuances, and how one has to come about with a cogent and practical reporting of events. Such events in this field require a lot of understanding of the subject. And the second one was to bring to the table a subject of China. When I was a young probationer in the government some 45 years ago, we did not have access to the kind of information we have today. We had to rely on human intelligence or from information that came to us through BBC or the Voice of America and things like this. So we had to put in a lot of hard work. As compared to 40 years ago today, you have an exponential availability of information. You have technology that helps you to understand the information. But all this is not going to be possible if we do not have an understanding of the target country we're dealing with. And I think that is one of the reasons why both Shashi Nair, Commodore Vasan, and we all decided that we'll come together to have this today conference. Because what has happened yesterday and today is just a snapshot of what we wish to present in the next 3 parts, where we want to bring in more focus on subjects of importance. Having said this, I would also like to use this opportunity to thank all those panelists and speakers who participated in our webinar, made it much more focused, sharp, and presented things in a cogent and focused manner. The importance is that we want our audience to understand that China, yes, is a difficult neighbor. Till 2049, we will have to bear with China's quest for 100 years of China and 75 years of the Chinese Communist Party. We have to deal with Xi Jinping, who is now deemed to be a president for life. There are things that we will have to live with an uncomfortable neighbor. And if we are not prepared to understand what he is doing or what his intentions are, we are not going to succeed. The government alone cannot deliver on certain areas, and government has limitations. We are not saying that the government is not the repository of information or knowledge or wisdom. Yes, the private sector, people like you and I, who have, between us on this screen, I think we have about 300 years of experience talking. Like what Jaidev Ranade said yesterday, you got to understand the Chinese to come to some conclusion about what they are doing. How many Tibetans do we have amongst ourselves who can tell us what is happening in Tibet, what's happening in Outer Mongolia? So I think we have a lot of ground to cover. And yesterday and today's discussions were the first steps, the baby steps. And I'm sure that my partner think tanks, PII and 3ECS will come together on the same platform. When we finish these forthcoming 3 subjects, each one of them is going to be very, very different. And I can assure you, no other think tank has attempted what we are attempting now. And we would all like you to come back and be with us and enjoy the experience. To me, it was very satisfying. And I think what I have learned in the last 2 days has been extraordinary. So with these few words, I would like to thank everybody who participated. My special thanks to both Shashi and Commodore Vasan, not forgetting my colleagues, Commodore Uday Rao and Chengappa. And I would like to make a special appreciation of the role played by Bala, who kept everything going seamlessly. We fortunately didn't work in silos. We worked across silos. We showed salience. Thank you very much. God bless. Jai Hind.